Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at some of our subscriber games that have been played on YouTube very recently in the classic Vienna opening. Our first game that we have is this game that is played between Just a Random Dudes and Ryan Azzaro. So let's dive right into it. Game starts with e4, we get e5, and now knight to c3 is played here. Now this is the starting position of what we call the Vienna opening, or the Vienna game. Black has many different replies. We're going to focus on 2 replies and 2 individual games that our subs have played. Probably the most common line that is played is knight to f6 here, which we'll look at in the second game. Or sorry, which is played in this game. Knight c6 is another move that is very playable as well. That will be in the second game. So let's start with knight f6. So after knight to f6, f4 is played. Now there are many different possibilities for white here. You can play f4, you can play knight to f3, knight 6 d4. This is the Scotch 4 knights, for example. You can also play bishop to c4. However, in this order, after black plays knight takes e4, position is very tricky to play for both sides here. If white takes knight, black plays d5, forking the bishop and the knight, and black ends up with a better position here due to having this one pawn in the center. You can play knight f6, bishop d6 castles, and black is doing very well, whereas this bishop on e4 can become a target very easily. So after bishop c4, knight takes e4, white normally would play this move queen to h5, threatening checkmate in 1 on f7. Now of course many of you will have seen a similar opening to this, where you'll see the classic scholars checkmate or the 4-move checkmate, where basically you get this clean checkmate on f7. If you do this, black can play knight to d6 here, which guards the pawn, attacks the bishop. Also, white can't capture the knight. If you play like queen e7, for example, white simply wins this knight on e4 here. So after knight d6, bishop b3, black can play either bishop to e7, which is probably the main line after queen takes e5 castles. Black generally is doing okay here. You can play knight c6 to attack the queen. Let's say white goes knight 2. You can even play a move like rook to e8, castles, and bishop to f8 to open up the e file for the rook on e8. So black has many different possibilities. Last but not least, in this position, black can also play knight c6, guarding the pawn. And after knight to b5, there's this very sharp variation that is known as the classic Frankenstein Dracula, due to the huge imbalances and nature of the position. Because black normally goes g6 here. If black were to say take the knight on b5, you get checkmated once again on f7. So g6, white goes queen to f3. Again, if knight takes knight, checkmate in 1. So here black normally goes f5, and now the point is, let's just say you move your knight here. Now I can capture the knight because there is simply no checkmate on f7. So here white has to play queen to d5 here. Again, the idea is if takes, you go for checkmate, and if black plays a move like bishop e7, you swap the juicers, and after takes, queen f7 would be made. So after queen to d5 is played, black normally goes queen to e7 or queen to f6, knight takes c7, king d8, knight takes a8, and b6. And the position is very sharp. I don't think any conclusions have been reached. I know in the short term, when you have the engine running, you see from the bar, it gives white a very big advantage here. However, I think according to modern day theory, it's still very unclear what's going on, because black has to develop the bishops very quickly. He's going to win the knight. He has these pawns in the center. These knights can jump very quickly. You can even bring the rook to the center, and white has 1 2 3 4 5 pieces that are underdeveloped. So this is one line that can happen. But in this game, we get this move f4 instead, which is probably the most principled approach in the Vienna. Now here, Ryan Azad plays d6. Now the main move that black probably should play here is d5. He should not capture the pawn on f4, because then white goes e5, kicking the knight out of town. Knight has to go back, and after knight to f3, let's just say d6, white can play queen to e2, bishop to e7, and now this move d4, consolidating this pawn in the center on e5. If there's a trade, you get the pawn back here. Also, white is threatening to win the pawn on f4 and then bring the rook into the center of the game very quickly. One sample line, let's just say bishop e6, bishop takes pawn, knight to c6, and now you can go rook to d1, hitting the queen. And after, say, queen to c8, you can even play a move like, I don't know which one is better. Let's just say knight, I'm going to say knight e4 just to keep peace on the board. And black has big issues. You can't really castle to the queen side because white controls the d file. It's very hard to develop this knight. Maybe knight h6 is a move and you can castle, but your king side is going to be very compromised here if you try to castle, and white has a big attack in the center of the board. So black normally should play d5 here, and now there are many different possibilities, but yours truly has actually played this quite a few times from the white side. So I'll just show you guys a couple of neat variations. So in the US Championship all the way back in 2010 in St. Louis, Missouri, I actually had this with white against Alexander Onishuk, who I believe at the time was a defending US champion. In that game, I decided, you know, it's not enough to play the Vienna opening. I have to try to play a Bond Cloud and also have some fun along the way. So in that game, I traded on d5, and now I play this move f takes e5. Now, on first glance, this looks completely insane because after knight takes knight, pawn takes queen to h4 check, you're like, well, look at this Hikaru guy, total beginner. G3 to stop the check, of course, queen e4, and black just wins the rook, right triangle, game over, queen e2 takes, GG. That's all she wrote. Nothing more needs to be said. However, white can actually play this very funny looking move, king to e2 here, playing it like a bond cloud. Now, unfortunately, black is completely fine, but there are some tricks here. So on first glance, you'll probably think, well, wait, can't black just go check, king f2, and I don't know, bishop c5? This actually doesn't work because white goes d4, building a chain of 3. And when you move the bishop, I develop the knight, and then I simply develop my bishop, bring the rook to the center, manually castle the king, and I simply have a big white center on top of having an extra pawn as well. So very quickly it can turn around. Now in that game, unfortunately, this line, as we see, doesn't turn into anything, because after king e2, black can play bishop g4 check, you go knight to f3, knight to c6, and now in the game I played queen to e1, offering the trade of the queens. Onoshuk played queen h5, and now I play this very funny looking move, king d1. Now again, this looks very, very strange because I've moved my king all over the board. I played a bond club, but now I've also just rearranged the king and the queen as though I don't know how to play chess. Anybody who's watched a lot of movies, you will notice that in many of the famous films, the king and the queen are set up on the wrong squares at the start of the game. So people probably think, well, he's just doing this to showboat like a Hollywood actor. At any rate, this is playable, but unfortunately it doesn't lead to much. Here, if black were to say trade on f3 and take on f3, after bishop to e2, queen to d5, white can play rook to b1, attacking the pawn. And when black castles, you can even play rook to b5 here, and after queen takes a2, this move bishop f3, and the position is very wildly out of control here. The king is actually very safe with all these pawns in front of it. Also, you have this great op targeting the knight and the pawn on this diagonal. Rook targets the pawn next to the king as well. You can even go queen e4, and so white is actually doing quite well in this position. Unfortunately, black can avoid all of these interesting lines by simply going knight takes pawn. I cannot capture the knight here, because after queen takes queen, the knight is simply pinned here. I would lose my king if I try to capture it. So in the game I played bishop to e2, but unfortunately after castles, knight takes knight, bishop takes bishop, we trade everything, and rook to e8. I played d4 in the game, but after this move f6, black is completely fine here, because temporarily white is going to end up a pawn. Let's say I go bishop f4, but after takes, and let's just say pawn takes, black can go bishop d6 and capture the pawn next move, and material will be even. You see 1 2 3 4 5, 1 2 3 4 5, and I will lose this extra pawn that I have in the center of the board. So the game would end up being a draw, but it was one cool line that was featured in one of my games, so I thought I would mention it. Additionally, after d5, there was another game that I played also in a United States Chess Championship in 2007, where I played this move f takes e5, knight takes e4, and queen to f3. But unfortunately, after knight to c6, bishop b5, pinning the knight so you can't capture the pawn, knight takes knight, pawn takes knight, being able to activate the dark square bishop here. Black can play queen h4, g3, queen to e4 check, forcing the queens off the board. Sorry. And after takes, bishop to f4 and h6. I had this in the US Championship in 2007 against Alexander Yermolinsky, a former US champion himself. Game would end very peacefully in a draw. So these are a couple of lines. Now, if you're looking to play against this, since I haven't really given you a concrete way to get an advantage, not that there is one, I would probably recommend that you take on e5, and after knight takes e4, you play knight f3. Idea being that after black plays, let's just say bishop e7, playing something simple like d3, knight takes, pawn takes, and after castles, going d4, building the center. Idea to play bishop d3 and castle your king out of the center as quickly as possible. So this would be my recommendation. Now in this game, we get the move d6 being played here by Ryan Azad. Knight to f3 is played. Now we get bishop to g4, so white cannot win this pawn. Takes, takes, takes. You lose the queen, and you lose the game. So here bishop to e2 is played to break the pin. We get pawn takes pawn. Now this is probably a mistake by Ryan Azad. Temporarily black is up a pawn here, but white is going to get a very big center with these pawns on d4 and e4, and potentially winning the pawn on f4 as well. So I probably recommend here, if I was playing this with black, to play something like knight to c6 here, and after d3 just bishop to e7 and castles. And until white forces you to make a decision with the bishop, you don't. If white plays h3, then you have to decide, do you trade the bishop for the knight? Do you go back, for example? What do you do? But unless white provokes you and forces you to do something, I would simply leave the bishop on g4. So in the game, we get e takes f4. Now d4 is played by just a random dudes. White has a big white center, and you can also take the pawn, and white is doing very well. Game continues with knight to c6. We get bishop takes f4 here. h6 is played, just stopping bishop g5. Not necessary, probably more important to simply castle the king, but it's played anyway. We get castles, g5, Again, not the right development scheme here. You should once again try to move the bishop and castle. G5, I guess you can play, but it's actually much worse in a lot of normal positions, because in this position, since we've played the Vienna here and pushed the F pawn, you're actually going to have this big issue where the F file is completely open now. So it's even worse. There's a pawn in F2, you could maybe justify it, but with the open F file here, playing H6 and G5 is simply a little bit too bold. So bishop G7 is played. We get D5 here, knight to E5, bishop D4 played by just a random dudes. Good move. Probably not the absolute best move, but it's good enough. If I were playing with white here due to the open F file, I would trade the knights. After takes, and D takes E5, there are a couple ways to play. There are a couple themes though. So bishop C5 is probably the best move to stop black from castling, but what I would recommend here is to go rook to F5, attacking the pawn. Black probably should just castle, because after you take the pawn, I assume there's some kind of idea where you move the knight somewhere to attack the rook. But even if there isn't, for the themes, because black has these pawns on G5 and E5 and no light square bishop to attack the rook, now you can simply stack the two towers. And when black say moves the knight to D7, you can play H4 with ideas like queen H5 and queen G4, and all of white's pieces are very harmonious. One line that I will show you guys is F6 to guard the pawn, and now you can play queen to G4. Let's just say black plays A6, you go knight to E2, say A5, knight to G3, A4, and now you go knight to H5. All these pieces are massing near the black king here. You have the rooks that are stacked, the queen is on a great square, knight targeting the bishop, pawn can capture, bishop can capture, and white should eventually be breaking through at some point. Just to show you guys an actual breakthrough, let's say black plays A3 here, you can go B3, let's just say B5, and here you can take, and now go bishop takes pawn, pawn takes bishop, rook takes pawn, the rooks get swapped, and now you're simply going to win this bishop on G7. Knight targets the bishop, rook and queen are behind it, king can't move anywhere, bishop can't move anywhere, game is over. So this is one sample line, probably what I would go for here since the F file is open. But again, I think the more important point to note is also that in this position you could take and go knight G3 and knight F5, and when black ends up with pawns that are like on G5 and E5 and there's a big weakness here, you should always be seeing if there's a way you can get a knight to that square or a rook to that square potentially. Now obviously very dependent on what piece is on the board, what the situation is, but nonetheless something to keep in mind if your opponent has a bishop on either G7 or E7, but the pawns are advanced to these two squares and there's this huge hole on F5. So bishop D4 is played instead. We get bishop takes F3, bishop takes F3 played, knight takes, queen takes, and here black castles. Already this is probably lost for black because you can't really move the knight because you lose the pawn and you get checkmated, and there's no way to guard the knight because white is attacking with uno, dos, tres. You have 1, 2 defending. This is simply already lost. So black castles, we get the swaps, everything comes off, rook F2. So white simply has an extra knight here and he's looking really good. Rook E1, rook A8, A4, C6, swap, rook F1. Again, all very good. White plays B4, rook E8, G3, D5, swap, and now rook to E7, D4, knight E4. Very well played, by the way, from just a random dudes here, a 900 player. Just very good stuff. Rook A7, rook D4, knight F2, takes, very good. Check, king G2. I assume he's gonna go A5. That's A6, okay. Rook A7. Now here, because the king is actually on D4, you should play A7, but very understandably, due to this pin on the second rank, just a random dude got afraid that after A7 there was king to E3 and black would win the knight on F2. Now this position, it doesn't work because you can play rook to E8 check, king has to go away, and then you make a queen, and white is simply winning the game. Nonetheless, very understandable. I would add as one note though, there are a lot of rook and pawn endgames where you have a situation where you have rook in front of a pawn with a rook behind the pawn. So if you disregard the whole king side, you always want to remember if this pawn gets the second to last row, the 7th rank before queening, if there's a way to move the rook with a check or a way to win material, generally you want to push this pawn up the board as far as you can. Now if black's king were magically able to be on G7, you don't want the pawn here because now there's no good move. You can't go here because I take and I cover this queening square, so you're unable to move the rook without losing the pawn. But just in general, if you have a rook in front of the pawn and there's a king or there's a queen or something that you can attack by moving the rook out of the way from in front of the pawn, you should be very mindful of that. So rook A7, king E3, rook takes F7, rook A6, knight G4, king D4 takes, rook A2. Now fortunately this is still winning for white even if black takes the knight, simply because you can go rook to G7 attacking the pawn. If black plays rook H5 to guard it, you go G4 removing the rook from the square where it guards the pawn. After rook H8, rook takes G5. With two connected pawns, this should be winning. So we get rook a2, rook f2, rook a6, check, king e5, h4, g4, knight e3, rook g6, rook f4. Great move to gobble the last pawn here, and the rest should be pretty basic here. Let's just make sure. Okay, looks pretty straightforward. Check, king h4, g5, h6, g6, king h5, king g8, knight to f6, king h8, and now g7, checkmate. Very, very well played by just a random dudes here at the end. Very, very good game overall. Can't really be critical of a whole lot. Perhaps in the middle game there were a couple moves that he could have played better, but I would say this is one of the reasons that I do really like the Vienna as an opening, because the plans tend to be pretty straightforward here in terms of what you're playing for. Now of course black did not play the most accurate line with d5, but nonetheless this idea that if black takes, you can build the big white center, capture the pawn, finish your development quickly, taking advantage of all of that. Also playing bishop d4, not the best move, but a good move nonetheless. I really have nothing negative to say about this game. Just a really good game played by this fan of Levy Rozman. Okay, so this is the first game that we took a look at. Now we're going to move on to the second game. Now this is a game between not GM Dima Shab 1390 and Botanic 1647. So a little bit stronger. Again, another 10-minute game. Both players have quite a bit of time. So e4, e5, knight to c3, and now we get this move knight to c6 by Botanic. Now this is very different, because here ordinarily, unlike in the other position, f4 is actually a fairly serious mistake in the opening, and the reason for this is that now after pawn takes, knight to f3 here, you'll notice there's a knight on c6 versus f6. So if we compare, if we contrast this here back to what we looked at before, after e takes f4, e5, the knight is on f6, so white gains a lot of space very quickly here, and the knight has to go back home. All of the other squares are simply covered here by the queen or by this knight on c3. So knight has to go home, and you lose a lot of time. White gets more development, and white's doing very well. Whereas with knight c6, if you play f4 here after pawn takes pawn, you don't have an e5 move to kick a knight. And in fact, if you play a move like d4 to take all the center, black can play queen to h4 check, and white's king is very vulnerable. So you would have to go knight to f3. But after g5 here, white's in a lot of trouble. Probably the best way to play is h3 to stop g4, but after bishop g7, d4, and a simple move like d6 here, black has connected the pawns here. They're guarded on g5 and f4, and black is simply much better. Now for players who are a little bit stronger, more at the intermediate level, you probably are wondering, well, can't white go bishop c4, g4, and castle? Now the reason that someone might think of this is because there is another opening that's very similar to this called the King's Gambit, and there's a specific variation called the Muzio Gambit, which I will show you guys in 1 second. But first things first, after g takes f3, queen takes f3, queen h4, black is doing very well here, simply because white cannot push this pawn to d4 because the knight will capture the pawn. So let's go to the videotape and rewind. So what I just mentioned here is that there is this variation in the King's Gambit called the Muzio, and this, you'll see this looks very similar, right? You brought the knight, the bishop out, black pushed the pawn to take the knight. But after castles takes, if black plays queen h4 here, for example, white can go d4. Now let's stop for a second and let's go back to the previous position so you guys can see the difference. If we go to this position, you'll notice that both sides have developed the knight. Now this is important to note because white has sacrificed a knight, so white is down a knight here, so white needs to develop very quickly. So the fact that black has this extra move to develop the knight means that black is doing very well here, because you cannot go d4, and if you play a move like d3, black will go knight to e5, forcing mass trades. If you trade the queens, you simply are just down a bishop here, and black is completely winning in the end game. And if you move the queen away to, let's just say, e2 after takes, many moves black can play here, but let's just say bishop to c5, king to h1, and d6, you do get a pawn on f4 here with rook takes f4. But after queen to d8, black has a very simple plan of going bishop to e6, queen to d7, and castling the king out of the center of the board, and you have no attack here because you don't have a bishop on c4, which could target the pawn on f7. So this is a big difference here. Now back to the Muzio for 1 second. The Muzio is a very fascinating opening. Now even this position after bishop to h6, it's very unclear in terms of what is happening, but white can play g3, queen f6, e5, and you'll notice that black is losing a lot of time here, having to move this queen all over the board. No development here. You have 1 2 3 4 5 6 pieces on their original squares, and white is doing very well. Anybody who's curious in my own games, I think I have a game from the World Blitz Championship many years ago in Moscow, Russia, against Dmitry Andreek, and I think there's video footage of that on YouTube. Maybe I'll even cover it here in a recap at some point. But at any rate, if you're looking for a game of mine with a Muzio or something very similar, make sure to check out that game. All right, so back to our Vienna. So unfortunately, due to the knights coming out on c3 and c6, f4 is not really a viable move here. So we got bishop to c4. Now this is a reasonable move, developing the bishop. Black plays bishop to e7. We get queen to f3, threatening to create the classic scholar's checkmate on f7. Knight to f6, knight to e2. Excellent move here to cover the d4 square. If you were to play a move like d3, black can play knight d4, forking the queen and the pawn, and you would have to retreat to d1 to guard the pawn. Because if you go to g3, for example, black can play knight takes pawn, checking the king, but also winning the rook, a typical fork that we see many times. So you'd have to go back to d1, and now after d6, you've simply lost time because you brought the queen out, and then the queen had to go home. So knight to e2, good move, preventing knight to d4, or at least offering a trade. We get castles, d6, and d3. Now, anybody who's been watching a lot of my videos, you probably noticed that it looks very similar to a game that I played in my most recent Title Tuesday victory, my 50th Title Tuesday victory, where we did a recap of a game that I played against Alexander Indjic in the very last round. This is very similar as a positional setup. Now, the point for white is very simple. What you're aiming for here is to potentially play queen g3 and f4, maybe knight g3 and knight f5 as well, or maybe even bishop g5 additionally. So you have a lot of flexible plans for moving the queen, knight g3, knight f5, bishop g5, maybe even knight d5, a3, etc, but you base your decision based off of what black does. So here we get bishop to g4, queen to g3 is played, and now bishop takes e2 is played by Botanic. Now this is a big mistake here because black is giving up the bishop pair, but more importantly, this bishop on c4 is really eyeing this diagonal very closely, and if you don't react immediately, you could end up in some serious trouble. So we get takes. Now knight a5 is played. Excellent move here by Botanic, even though the computer doesn't like it, because if you don't go knight a5, let's just say you play a6 and white can play a3, for example. After knight a5, bishop to a2, the bishop is always on this long diagonal. You don't have a light square bishop to swap it with, and so the bishop will always be spying the pawn and the king here. To contrast that, if we go back to say a position like this after a6, a3, knight a5, bishop a2, where when you do the light square bishop, I can always just go bishop to e6 to offer the trade, but once that bishop is gone, the bishop will always be spying the diagonal. So we get knight to a5, we get bishop to h6 played here. Now it's worth noting, if white tries to keep the bishop on the board with bishop b5, after a6, bishop a4, and b5 here, you have to retreat to b3, and now black can swap the knight for the bishop, and the position is still completely playable, but you no longer have the bishop pair, and you no longer have any threats on this diagonal towards the black king. So we get bishop to h6 here, threatening to go for checkmate in one. Black cannot capture the bishop because then I would capture your king. Get knight to e8, not g6, by the way, because then white simply takes the rook, and a rook is simply worth more than a bishop on f8. We get knight to e8, preventing the checkmate. Bishop to d2, played by not GMHikaru. Now, if I were playing here with white, I'm not sure exactly what I would do, but it feels like in this bishop, maybe there's even a move like f4 potentially to try to open up this f file, because again, black's knight is very passive. It's on the back rank. The rook and the queen are passive, and if we just look at this conceptually here after takes and say bishop takes f4, with all these passive pieces, it feels like white should be doing well. White has already finished the development. You can bring the last remaining rook into the game very soon, and it just seems easier to play. At any rate, we got bishop d2, we get a swap, c5 played here. Now this is a very bad move by Botanic, because what it does here is it creates this huge weakness on d5. White is this great square for the pony. Additionally, because the pawns are doubled, black does not have a bastion on d4. If you were to, let's just say white goes knight c3, knight c7, I'm going to play what's a good move here? Let's just say queen d3, knight to e6, and knight d5. You'll notice the only way for black to remove this knight is to go back and trade it, because you can't magically put a pawn on either of these two squares here. Let's just say you go knight d4. If you could magically put this pawn here or here, it would target the knight, but your pawns are too far away. You've pushed these pawns already, and so the knight just has this great protected square, and white is in really good shape. Additionally, your knight on d4 is not a bastion, because here I can go c3 and kick the knight out of town, and you simply cannot use the square for the knight, whereas I can use this great outpost for the knight on d5. So c5 is not a great move here. Probably if I was playing with a black piece, there are two things I would look to do. Either I'd look to play c6 and d5 to break this open in the center of the board, or play f5 to try and get rid of white's central control of this pawn on e4, which prevents d5. Either plan I think is playable. I think at the top level it's still relatively okay for black, but again, just a general thing to keep in mind when you have these structures. So you get c5. Now f4 is played by not GMHikaru. Great move. We get f6 here. If black were to take on f4, now you can even take with the bishop, and black is this very weak backwards pawn. You cannot push it forward because white controls the square, and white is angling with the queen and the bishop. You have rook d1 as well to win the pawn, and it just looks quite miserable. So f6 is played. Now we get knight to c3, knight to c7. f5. Excellent move here, because what you'll notice now is that black no longer can jump with the knight to e6 and d4. It's going to take a long time. You need you need like 1 2 3 just to get to d4, and in the process you're going to be conceding the d5 square. Also, white has ideas to try and lift the rook and attack with the pawns on the king side. So we get a6 here, bishop h6 again, rook to f7, guarding against the checkmate threat, and now knight to d5 is played by white. Now this is a horrible move, because what you're doing is you're offering exchange of the knights, where when black has a very passive knight. Even if we get a position like, let's just say this, for example, you'll notice that black's knight is really misplaced. There are no squares available. e6 is not available, d5 is not available, b5 is not available. So because this knight is so bad and you always have this great square for the knight, it simply doesn't make sense to trade your great knight for his knight, which simply can't go almost anywhere. So I don't like knight d5. Black does trade, because now you trade your good knight for his bad knight, and now the center of the board also becomes close. If we go back here, you'll notice that you can always even try to say stack the 2 rooks on the d file to put pressure on this pawn, but now it's not even a weakness anymore when we look at this position, because now the center of the board is completely closed. So now black's pawn structure is completely fine. Game continues with bishop f8. We get rook to f3 here. White tries to lift the rook and attack on the king side. b5, bishop to d2, a5. Now queen to h4. The idea is to play rook h3 and checkmate on h7. b4 is played by Botanic, and now we get rook to h3. h6 played, queen g4. Another excellent move, trying to capture the pawn due to the pin here with the bishop. King h8, rook to g3 is played here. Bishop e7 is played. If black were to play a move like c4, again you can eat the pawn on h6, because after pawn takes bishop, you have queen g8, which would be checkmate. So we get bishop to e7. So now if you take on h6, I'm simply covering both of the checkmating squares with my rook and my queen. We get rook f1 here, queen to f8, rook f3, queen g8, and now rook to h3. Now this is already probably lost for black, simply because you cannot, there are no open files on the queen side, so white can put these rooks on h3, g6 maybe, and with your king on h8, it feels like this is borderline impossible to defend. So we get rook to h3, queen to h7, queen to h5, attacking the rook on f7, rook f8, rook fg3. Another perfect move here. We get bishop d8, bishop takes h6. Now this is a great move. If I were playing with white, I probably would have played rook g6 first, because now it's very clear what the plan is. If black was like c4, you can take and take with the rook, and you have a legendary triple stack, and you will win the game very shortly. But bishop takes h6 is still good enough. We get pawn takes, rook g6. Great move from not GMHikaru here, just going to capture and win the game. c4 takes, king g8, queen h8, checkmate. Wow. What a game from not GMHikaru, from this late middle game position, understanding to bring these rooks in. Very impressive play from a 1300. Probably he's studied some tactics, or he's seen these themes before, and once he did it, he just blew his very esteemed 1650 opponent off the board, and it wasn't even remotely close. So what to say about this game? Now this game is very well played by GMHikaru. I do feel he was a little bit too fixated on this bishop h6 move. I think he did it at least like 2 or 3 times. Like, it's not necessarily a bad move here, but then when he does it again, and I think he did it a 3rd time even, right? Did he do it a 3rd time? Maybe he didn't actually do it a 3rd time, but it felt like he was maybe a little bit too fixated on playing bishop h6 or bishop takes h6. Mind you, it did win him the game when all was said and done, so I can't be too critical, but that maybe is the one thing I would say, is it felt like he was a little bit too fixated on the idea. But overall, a very good game. The one thing that I would stress about this, and again, at 1300 1400 level, not super critical, but as you're getting to like 1800 1900 level, think about your pieces when they're exchanged, assuming that there's not a lot of chaos in the center. For example, say we have some position like, what's a good example? I'm trying to think about this. What's an example of an exchange? Like, let's just say, for example, you have some position like this where black has a decision, there's a lot of chaos here on the queen side, for example, or even let's just say it's like this. There's a lot of chaos here, you'll notice, due to the pawn structure. So there's a lot of chaos. You can't necessarily look at it as like a straight up trade or piece for piece, but when it's a very stable position like this, where both sides only have knights on the board and there are no like pawn captures or anything else going on at the moment, you really should try to think about whether your piece, in this case your knight on c3, is better than this knight on c7 or not, and whether you want to trade. Same thing goes for bishops. Let's just say let's just say I can play some random moves here and you get some position like this. Now, disregarding the fact that I can take the pawn and win the game in a situation like this, I mean, it's not completely stable, but white has a choice. Do you want to trade the bishops or not? Now in this position, there are pluses to trading the bishop potentially, but in general, keeping the bishop on the board makes much more sense because this bishop is walled in by all the pawns, and so it's just a very, very passive bishop. It doesn't really have much scope on any of the diagonals. So in this situation, again, is your bishop better than his bishop? It is. So generally you don't want to trade unless there's something leading to, say, a forced win or you're way ahead in material. So that is what I would recommend that you keep in mind with either bishops or knights. When the position is very, very stable, is your minor piece, the knight or the bishop, better than their knight or bishop? Do you really want to trade it? Which pieces should you keep on the board? It is something to consider as you're improving and becoming a stronger intermediate player. That's my only real critique of this game. Otherwise, the attack was executed nearly flawlessly. Very, very good game by not GMD Mashab, and that's why I think you should play the Vienna. Very, very good play in both of these games from players with white pieces. So on that note, you guys, I hope you've enjoyed this video on the Vienna. I sort of was a little bit all over the place in terms of variations. We focused on two specific ones with this knight c6, bishop c4, and then we focused on knight f6, f4. In the future, I probably will do another video on sub games featuring the line knight to f6 and g3, in case you guys are wondering, because this is also another variation that many players have played, including myself, with the white pieces. But I do hope that you guys have enjoyed this video of subscriber games. Make sure to keep those subscriber game submissions coming, and we'll be back very, very soon with some more great YouTube content. So once again, make sure you hit that subscribe button below, and we'll be back very soon with some more great opening content here on YouTube. See you guys. Bye.